Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We've got a lot to cover today. We're really excited today to have the opportunity to share some great ideas, very powerful insights, some unique perspectives on social studies and instruction, and of course the broader discussion of the state of social studies and its role in the curriculum. With so much has changed in the last several years, and this is such an incredible opportunity for everyone that is really passionate about education and social studies to make a meaningful impact, not just with your school community, but also how we look at social studies within the curriculum on a national level. My name is Ryan Quinn. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Herff Jones Nystrom. For those of you not familiar with the Nystrom brand, we have been an educational publisher for over 110 years. Our parent company, of course, is Herff Jones. We're best known for our hands-on philosophy and our social studies programs that provide ideal context for reading, writing, speaking, listening, as well as exploring research, writing, collaboration, and assessment. Of course, our flagship product, Stratologica, has been receiving a lot of attention lately, as we were a finalist in 2 awards at the South by Southwest Festival in March. So we're real humbled by the recognition. Stratologica is a free app in the iTunes Store, and it's also available on the desktop and laptops at www.stratologica.com. In this webinar, and what we're going to talk about today is really speaks real strongly about what we are as a brand. We support educators and students and advocate on behalf of the social studies by providing new ways of thinking about a problem or reframing the thinking of a particular issue so that you have the information you need to create the types of meaningful experience that are going to drive student achievement and performance, and even beyond that, curiosity and the more important part of inquiry, which Robert is going to talk to us about a little today. Of course, I'm joined by Robert Austin, K-12 education specialist with the Utah State Office of Education. Hi, Robert. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
This is the third in a series of webinars that Robert has done with us on this topic. We appreciate his willingness to share some of his thoughts and ideas. There's always a lot of interest when we do these type of webinars, and as a result, thousands of educators have tuned into this series over the years. Going back to the fall of 2011, as the Common Core were being introduced, Robert joined us to discuss this idea of it being a Sputnik moment for social studies, and it was a very powerful idea. We were in a situation in the No Child Left Behind era where social studies was really being pushed aside for more time for literacy and math to meet AYP. And social studies has such an important role in the curriculum, and that webinar we talked about this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, similar to the launch of Sputnik, where with a single shot the Soviet Union bolted ahead in the space race and kicked off a wave of national attention and investment in science from the United States. In the same way that the United States felt compelled to invest heavily in our science programs to counter the weight of the Soviet Union during that time, we see this as a similar opportunity to reestablish social studies and its role in the curriculum. And last year, we started to, as we started to prepare for implementing Common Core, Robert talked to us a little bit about some of the problems that we were dealing with in a webinar titled, Houston, We Have a Problem. So today, we're going to continue on this theme, this grand opportunity of reestablishing and understanding the essential components that are delivered in the social studies classroom. We'll introduce this idea of social studies as a verb, which I think is a very interesting way to look at it. Robert has a lot of fabulous content to share with you this afternoon, and to make sure that we stay on time, and we just have a couple of housekeeping tips. Okay. This is being recorded and will be available to anybody that wants to share it with colleagues or staff, or anybody that wasn't able to join us today. We have a lot of folks that have expressed interest in this webinar, and we've got a very healthy group of folks that are tuned in today. All the PowerPoint slides and any sort of links that Robert introduces, as well as the recorded version of this webinar and some white paper resources will be available at our blog. These links will be sent to you in an email follow-up following this webinar in the next 24 hours. We'll be live tweeting this webinar from H.J. Nystrom account, and we're going to use the hashtag #SSLiftoff. So if you're at home and you want to join in to that conversation, the side conversation, absolutely, we'd encourage that. And of course, if you need a certificate of attendance, definitely email me and I can get that out to you. That's just one of the services that we provide. And before I turn this over to Robert, and before we get into some of the things that we're going to discuss today, we sort of have a little poll we want to start off with today. So I'm going to launch this poll, and you should see this up on your screen, and we'll let it kind of go for about 30 seconds. And if you just want to take some time and answer this question, we'll just kind of gauge if folks understand what the C3 framework is. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and publish this. Looks like about half of the folks have heard of it, and exactly half haven't. So it's a great opportunity to introduce this idea and talk about it, Robert. And
Great.
So without further ado, I'm going to hand over control of the presentation to Robert. Before I do that, I just want to make sure that if you guys have questions, make sure you use the questions box in the GoToMeeting app, and I will do my best to make sure that those are answered on this webinar. And Robert, I'm going to send this over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Ryan. And it's a great opportunity. I'm very excited about being able to share some ideas I have with you today. It's been an amazing ride these last few years in terms of the reforms in the Common Core state standards and in the conversation around the country regarding standards reform and the opportunities for social studies. And in many ways, we really are in liftoff. We're definitely aimed in the right direction, and even, frankly, as a nation, there's pretty significant alignment across the board among a range of disciplines, not just within social studies, but in general in education. When I look at, for example, mathematics, I see the language in the mathematics core that talks about the kinds of things that are expected for mathematical thinking, and you see incredibly consistent themes of problem solving and inquiry. When you look at the ELA core, you see similar language, not only in the explicit mention of literacy skills in the language arts, but also implicitly within the idea of what good ELA instruction looks like. And the same can be said for the next generation standards and the framework for those standards in science. The scientific and engineering practices that are at the heart of K-12 science education is, again, consistently talking about questioning and selecting sources and evaluating data and inquiry. So we're definitely in a very exciting opportunity for social studies to be in alignment and lifting off into the same direction. And so a part of that, and added to that whole mix, is this new document called the C3 framework. And I think of the C3 framework is a great way to discuss this idea of social studies as a verb, social studies as action, social studies as performance, social studies as a way for students to clearly articulate the role they have in participatory democracy. This document, the C3 framework, it's different in that it's not standards. It's not a standards document per se. It's a really unprecedented collaboration of the social studies community across the spectrum of disciplines, whether it's history, geography, economics, even psychology, sociology. They have very clearly articulated in the C3 framework an inquiry arc that supports what's necessary to successfully do social studies and to think about social studies as a verb. So one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure we talked about this document today, and it's one of those things where as a classroom teacher, you may say, oh, one more document put on a shelf. But I really think this is another watershed moment for social studies. This document in one place articulates the processes and the skills that are unique to social studies. And you can find out more at the link that I have here on the website. But the reality is we have got to be clear about the unique role that social studies plays in the development of the kinds of skills that we want our students to have, and frankly, the kinds of people we want our students to be. The great thing about the framework was it was created by a collaboration of states and social studies stakeholders, but it's not a national standards document. There are no new national standards content-wise in social studies. And frankly, anybody who's been in a faculty meeting discussing school policy on, uniforms or you name it, knows just how hard it is to bring anybody to consensus, even in a faculty. So the idea that we would come to some kind of consensus nationally on content standards, it's not a high likelihood. That's not really relevant. What's relevant here is that this framework provides a way forward for classroom practitioners to really take our instruction up a notch or two or three. So when we think about implementing truly effective social studies instruction, there are instructional shifts, true, deep, profound instructional changes that are implied either implicitly or explicitly in the C3 framework. So the C3 framework is based on this concept of an inquiry arc. It's very similar in so many ways to the whole notions that are at the heart of mathematics instruction, at the heart of ELA and science, as I said before. And you can see on this slide where it talks about the basic movement through a process of inquiry. That what we start with in our most basic elements in social studies, we are having students ask really fantastic, compelling questions. That's our job. And the great thing about social studies is we get the opportunity to ask and wonder about some of the most fascinating things that have ever happened on the planet, or might happen on the planet, and to plan ahead, and to learn from the past, and to think in all sorts of ways. So the C3 framework starts with this concept of questions, but it's incredibly important to note that that first dimension is reminding you that this framework has nothing to say about content. The content, the questions that you will explore with your students, those questions are up to you. They're up to your district. They're up to your state standards. That's your responsibility. And our responsibility as educators is to make sure that we first help our students develop and really think about how it is that we're going to answer questions. And then it moves into thinking specifically, how is it that we look at those questions from a civic standpoint as a political scientist? How do economists look at those issues? How do geographers think about and wonder about those questions? And how do historians look at the questions we're asking? Dimension 3 looks at thinking about the sources we're going to use, both gathering them but also evaluating them, moving beyond a simple internet research. I mean, in my days, it was we went to the encyclopedia, and what we've got to now do is understand that with the wealth of information that's available to students, we have to help them understand how to gather it and evaluate it. And then they develop claims, and they use evidence, and that is the same kind of language that you're seeing in the ELA core in terms of crafting an argument. And frankly, it gets at what Bruce Lesh talks about when he's in some of one of his most recent books, his only book right now, but we're hoping for lots more from him. This idea of helping students develop skills as historians, not because we expect them to be historians, but that we expect them to use those skills in understanding their responsibilities and their role in society. And finally, dimension 4 is communicating conclusions and taking informed action. And that, frankly, is the whole concept of social studies as a verb. The idea of we want students to understand their role in society and to take action. Now, taking action might simply be creating the presentation. We're not talking about marching in the streets. We're talking about students understanding how to write a letter to the editor, or going to learn how to vote, or practicing analysis of data from the newspaper to really understand it, politicians' arguments, or whatever it is. It's taking those skills and putting them into practice. One of the things that I think is really critical is we may have blast off, but we can't get lost on the way. Now, it's really easy when we head into the unknown and the uncharted territory. It can be kind of scary. And we're moving into new and uncharted territories. It's a lot of times, it's a lot easier to just think about, well, let's just teach the way we always have. Let's just do things the way we've always done them. But when you finally realize and know the direction that you have to go, and you get clarity about that, it requires action. I think this kind of gets to one of my favorite sayings, which is that teaching is easy if you don't know how. And it's kind of a little riddle, but it gets back to that concept of if we think that teaching is some simple process of recall and regurgitation, then it's pretty simple. When we suddenly start to realize all of the kinds of complicated processes that are at the heart of great education, then we've got some challenges. And so what we need to do is make sure that we're not confused about the opportunities that we have ahead of us. And it can be easy to get confused. And let me just say that there are some really familiar ideas in a lot of what we've talked about. There are going to be people who said, oh, I've heard all of this before. I know I've heard about argument. It may have been persuasion in the past. Or I've heard about compelling questions. We used to call them essential questions. Or we've done content area literacy, or we've focused on inquiry. I totally get that. But what I'm saying is we can't get lost in thinking about these as if they're familiar ideas that therefore don't have profound implications. And what I mean by that is I have been in professional learning communities with teachers who are meeting together to talk about common goals. They have a concept of essential questions, and they're pulling the data together to look at the latest common assessment they've created, and they're going to look at the data from those assessments. And I'm excited about the kinds of language they're using in their conversation. But when the rubber hits the road, and when I met with them, here's what I saw. I saw simple recall assessments that really pushed only the basic lowest common denominator of cognitive reasoning. I saw essential questions that were not essential questions. They were yes or no questions that were easily answerable. Well, that is not at the heart of some of these ideas. These ideas are hard. It's not easy necessarily to create a true inquiry-based, essential question-based, argument-rich learning experience. We can't get lost in space. We really have to understand that we cannot get lost in space. And one of the challenges that social studies constantly has to deal with is this concept of coverage and worrying that we cannot move into any kind of skill development because we've got to cover our content. Students have to do something with the knowledge they're learning. That's where social studies becomes a verb. When we start saying, students, you've learned this content, but now we're going to apply it. We don't sit around and just receive a narrative in a history class. We don't just receive map information in a geography class. We have to be explicitly teaching the tools to our students so they can understand how knowledge is created. And it means being very explicit about what it is that we're teaching, so students can be incredibly metacognitive about their work. Bruce Lesh, in his book, Why Won't You Just Tell Us the Answer, he discusses how you cannot separate content from an explicit attention to process. You don't do that in other disciplines. We can't divorce the content from the process in our discipline as well. That's why in his classroom, history is he got a history laboratory. So when we talk about social studies as a verb, he's one of those authors and teachers who's really doing it. So this concept of being lost in space, we can't continue to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. And so that gets us to the heart of what we're really, what results are we really shooting for? What is it that we are aiming for? And so let's get clear about what moon we're aiming for, because it's very easy to talk the talk and talk about all the kinds of things we want to happen for students and still end up hitting this 19th century moon when we really need to be aiming for the 21st century. Now, I mean, take a look at this geography book. I can't really read the date there. It's in the 1880s, I think. You'll see that the western states include Iowa, where I grew up. And you'll also see the kinds of questions that are being asked in the 1800s. And the kinds of questions that are being asked are the kinds of simple recall questions that unfortunately and frankly still occupy a vast amount of the kinds of instruction that occurs in school. We have way too many students who are doing cognitively low-level work at a time when we need to push them to be thinking about the deep, rich, fascinating cognitive work that geographers really do, that historians really do. When we think about what geographers have been doing over the last few months, trying to find the Malaysian Airlines jet and triangulating data and looking at water flow and sound patterns and all the kinds of things that geographers would look at and understand, I mean, think about that as a task for students to work on rather than worrying about coloring a map or memorizing data that they could just as easily ask Siri about. So we have to move beyond total recall.
Can I interrupt you real quick? I've got a couple questions before we get too far away from this. I thought we would just kind of address them.
Great.
Got one question. How do you define the relationship between the C3 and the literacy standards in the Common Core, which kind of go into social studies, but not to this degree? Is that correct?
Yeah, right. So there was, in the C3 framework, there's a very clear attention to the groundwork laid by the literacy expectations in the ELA core. So it's still confusing for people sometimes to understand that in all of our states across the country, we have social studies standards. And in addition to that, we have, for those states who have adopted the Common Core standards, we have an expectation that there are certain literacy skills that we expect students to master in history, social studies, science, and the technical subjects. And so for our work in history and social studies, the kinds of expectations that are laid out in the ELA are dovetailed and then expanded upon in the C3. So C3 says absolutely literacy is a hugely important piece of what it is. There's no historian who doesn't read, write, speak, and listen. But what we then say is it's not enough to just think about our work as an end result, as literacy being an end result for our work. It's the flip. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. But specifically, there's a really nice dovetail between what's expected in ELA and what we see in the C3.
And Robert, one more question from a future teacher. Always love to see future educators joining us in these discussions. She's wondering about implementing the C3 framework. If you have any suggestions for implementing the C3 framework particularly that last step in helping students to understand their role in society using like a multicultural approach.
Oh yeah. Well, I think that here's one of the ways. If I were a classroom teacher, what I would do is I would look at the specific skills in Dimension 2 that talk specifically about history, geography, civics, and economics in very clear ways about what are the kinds of things we do in those domains. And then how do I then craft the questions? So for example, continuity and change is an idea. It's a thematic idea. Or sourcing, or evaluating sources. All of those specific skills that we're talking about within a history classroom, for example, you would then think, how do I connect the lives of my students at this point in time to the big questions in history, and do it in a way that really pushes that literacy skill, the disciplinary skill, and is interesting to them. I mean, there is no reason why a social studies classroom should ever be boring. We have the best possible topics to choose from, and that's really what is exciting about the kinds of conversations that Bruce Lesh has and that the Century Framework really talks about. And that's why beginning with the question is really the critical piece.
Okay, great.
Right.
Thanks.
You bet. So I was talking with Ryan earlier. I want to really make sure we have a conversation. So as questions come in, I think it's great. I mean, the whole point here with C3 is that, and this is the first real, I think in a lot of ways, a very powerful instructional shift. The idea of beginning with the act of questioning and true inquiry. One of the challenges we know in learning is that anything we learn, if it's a perspective other than what we have, it can be really hard. That if we're reading an opinion piece that disagrees with the way we think, it is physically difficult to understand that information. Our brain struggles with it, and the text complexity rises just because it's coming from a perspective other than our own. And one of the things that we have to do in social studies is constantly help students learn those perspectives so they can understand the pastness of the past. They can understand why people possibly made the decisions they made in the 1820s or the 1950s, but also so they can understand their own perspectives and the perspectives of others. It's an incredible opportunity. One of the things that we have to think about is this idea of inquiry. And for a lot of people, this may not seem like that big of a shift. You know, people will say, well, I already teach with this idea of questions. But for many of us and for many people in social studies, it becomes easier to just say things like, I'm teaching World War II, or I'm covering the early colonizing process in the US, rather than saying things like, my students are wondering how a war can become a global conflict, or what happens when a country starts a new colony, or why would a brother actually kill a brother in the case of a civil war, for example. So allowing students the chance to ask those questions and continue with inquiry rather than merely seeking out the evidence to support already held opinions, that is a huge shift. It's vital. It's important. And it's one of the keys to learning empathy, is to actually listen to and learn from sources and people with whom we disagree. So a big shift is to think about questioning. And that's why the C3 framework begins with the act of creating compelling questions. It's not saying here's the content you have to teach. It's saying whatever content you're teaching, you think about what are the essential questions. Now this is work that Grant Wiggins and Jay McTee have done for years. It's central to the other core documents that are out there. One of the things that's important, though, here is to think about what people like Bruce Van Sledwright, who's done some awesome work on assessment and wrote an introduction to the C3 framework at the NCSS website. He talks about how it's very important to begin with to remember that our role as educator, our role as the more knowledgeable other, is to help students learn how to craft those compelling questions, but to make sure that we really craft them to start with, to make sure that they're not just trivial, easily answerable questions. Of course, students can ask some really incredible and profound questions, but they need a lot of guidance to start with, and we have to scaffold that process as much as any other process. So you need to remember, if there's no other takeaway from today, it's this: that you're a leader in social studies education in whatever role you have, whether you're a teacher or a superintendent, curriculum designer, you're a leader. And as a leader, you need to help set the questions for inquiry. There's no national curriculum telling you what to ask. There may be state or district ideas on that, but it's up to you to set a profound inquiry process in motion and to think about how do we take the questions up a notch. So we don't have to ask things like, what was the order in which the 13 colonies were founded? I mean, seriously? I don't even know the answer to that question. But if I were to ask questions about what life skills did it take to be a successful colonist, or what were the reasons why countries started colonies around the world, I mean, those are the kinds of deeper and more thought-provoking questions, especially even because today we're dealing with the ramifications of worldwide colonialism. So if we're going to create questions, people like Bruce Lush have done a lot of work thinking about how you help really ask good questions. That's a hard first step. So Bruce Lush has great criteria for these sorts of questions. This whole PowerPoint will be here. I'm not going to go through all of them. What I'm going to tell you instead is at the bottom is this link to his book, Why Won't You Tell Us the Answer? And you can look through and think about the argument he makes for really making social studies a verb, in that we are moving forward with the inquiry process. And the first step, the most crucial step, is to ask the right question. So it takes a lot of practice. It gets easier as it goes along, but it's at the heart of the first instructional shift that's out there. The great news is there are compelling questions every day in the newspaper. You open a paper up and you go, why can't these people get along? Or, well, what are the limits of governmental power? Or you think about turning points in history. And I think about the French Revolution, and there's Marie Antoinette up on facing the guillotine, and you would ask, what in the world has happened to get us to this point? Or you think about just the massive challenges and future problems that we face. How can we be best stewards for this planet? What are the obligations we have to one another? And then there are great resources out there. Gilder Lehrman is an awesome resource to see essential questions that are great for teaching American history. They certainly can push the level of cognitive rigor farther and higher toward the goal we're trying to set. So, Ryan, I don't know if you've gotten any other questions about questions, but we'll keep going.
I've got one here. Give me a second. Pull it up.
Sure. Sure.
This individual is looking for an example of a higher order question for locating places on a map, because it sounds like it's part of the curriculum. Students need to be able to locate this or that on a map. Do you have,
Oh yeah, you know what I would. Well, I'll tell you what. When it comes to maps, maps aren't just about where stuff is, but they're also about why stuff is where it is. And you can do so many cool things with layers of information before you ever even get to the political map. You could be looking at water resources, or temperature, or altitude, And then from there, you could ask students to make predictions about where people might have lived. What are the reasons why people might live in a certain place? And then, bang, up comes a political map on a layer, and they can test to see how they did. And what they're going to do is they're going to then know why the where is where it is, and it's going to stick a lot easier than just memorizing the dots on a map. So that's one quick idea. So I think that for me the thing about questions is why would we not have students be wondering about questions that we want to find answers to? And what are the kinds of things that we find interesting and fascinating, and that even today for adults, a lot of these essential questions are questions we're going to think about and wonder about our whole lives. And that's part of what makes great curriculum for kids. So when we think about instructional shifts, another thing that you see very often in the ELA core, but also in C3, is the idea of establishing collaboration. Kathy Swan and John Lee are both people who have been instrumental in working on and developing the C3 framework, and they really kind of began to understand how important it is to think about working together. And I think that we take that for granted. We think about group work or things like that as an essential piece of a classroom, but this idea of collaboration, of with other people coming to some kind of understanding, with other students who see things differently than us, how do we collaborate together on a fundamental academic exercise? If we want students to have the practice of engaging in civil discourse, if we want students to be able to do that kind of work when they leave our classrooms, then they've got to practice in our classroom. And many of the core standards in ELA specifically talk about making sure that students work together in meaningful ways. I was just recently at our state model United Nations. 600 Utah students were talking about, NGOs and translateral collaboration and the kind of things they needed to do to get Cuba to sign on to this agreement. And it was great as I walked past these little clusters of students collaborating. It was a little bit like American Idol for social studies geeks. They were having a blast, and it once again showed this concept of social studies as a verb, of the actual doing of it instead of just receiving information that they won't remember past the next exam. One of the things that we have to think about is working on trying to figure out how to integrate content and skill in a meaningful way. Way too often we get caught in this trap of thinking that students either they need skills first or they need content first. And you'll hear people say things like, well, I'd love to have them look at primary sources, or I'd love to have them struggle with context or interpretation, but they just don't know enough yet. They don't know enough yet about this topic. We can't have a debate in this class because they don't know enough. And what then happens is people feel, and teachers feel like they really have to force feed content at all costs to these students. But this is just the sort of thinking that will lead to disengaged students and low levels of cognitive rigor, because we are not pushing the skill development. So what we end up with is just trying to fill people with information that they can parrot back to us. As Bruce Lesh writes in his book, he says, it's not learning a litany of information about any subject that inspires interest. It's instead the utilization of that information to address complicated and thought-provoking questions. So when we think about those skills, we are then it's really incumbent on us then to get clear about the specific instructional skills that we're talking about. And that's where the next instructional shift comes in. Articulating what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about disciplinary literacy. What are those practices and outcomes? And one of the really, I think, interesting points that Bruce Van Sledright makes in his latest book on assessing social studies is this idea that there's kind of a false notion in the ELA core that says literature is work that you need to do some real analysis of and understand metaphor and understand similes and understand the author's tone and all of that, but that then there's this kind of informational text, and it's almost as if the message is sent. Informational text is expository and, I'm just going to put quotation marks around, true information, right? And that it's devoid of bias, and that it's somehow objective. Well, what we know in history and even in geography is that informational text still has to be understood. It has to be analyzed. People have to understand the bias. They have to understand the authorship. They have to understand the purpose for why that memo was created by that president, or why this message was sent from the spy, or whatever it is. There's still information in this text that has deep, as Van Sledright talks about, deep interpretive and perspectival character. So text, historical text, geographic text, it doesn't matter, need careful literary-like interpretation. It's pretty heady stuff. It's pretty complicated stuff. That's, again, the argument that we can make about why social studies is so important. So we need to, and I think that the cool thing about the C3 is that it articulates, again, what are those specific disciplinary literacy practices. Questioning, selecting sources, gathering information from the sources, making claims, using evidence, adapting arguments and explanations, constructing arguments, presenting those arguments, analyzing social problems, taking informed action. Those are all just deeply, richly a part of what makes social studies such a central part of a child's education. You don't have STEM education, you don't have science education in this void where you don't think about the implications for the science you're learning. You have to understand the connections between science and social studies. You have to understand the connections between ELA and social studies. So when we think about disciplinary thinking, thinking like a geographer, thinking like a political scientist, and people have taken this on to begin to even talk about thinking not just like a geographer, but like a GIS specialist. So, you know, they think about it in terms of even career paths within these areas. But frankly, I'm not talking about and expecting that students will all become geographers or political scientists. We certainly don't have enough jobs for every economist out there. But what we have are skill sets that really reflect the job that every person is going to have, which is that of being a citizen. And so that's a critical piece for that piece of disciplinary thinking that the C3 framework really lays out in a really, really nice way. When you think about, just think about how geography texts aren't strictly speaking informational texts that don't require analysis. When you've got a text, a map, if it's got a map, if the name says Burma, that's certainly one perspective. If it says Myanmar, that's another perspective. If it's, is it the Ukraine or the Crimea? There's been a political firestorm over simply whether a map is going to say Sea of Japan or the EC. So we know that all of these texts have bias in them. Bias isn't a bad word. It's just a concept that students need to understand. So again, it gets back to this whole beautiful opportunity to articulate the really cognitively rich aspects of great social studies. So we have a shared commitment to cognitive rigor. And the interesting thing is there's a lot of conversation around the country around assessments and assessments coming out and statewide assessments, and whether social studies is either mentioned enough or too much, or what are the implications for us in terms of testing and assessment. And what I can say is that if nothing else, we need to understand that we are all in this together, that we have incredible challenges for all of us posed by these new standards. These new standards are not asking us to continue to do the same things we've always done. They are expecting us to push our students as well as ourselves. And luckily there's some great thinkers out there. One of the people who's really doing some, I think, amazing and exciting work on the idea of cognitive rigor is Karen Hess. I've got a link here to her Center for Assessment, and Karen Hess's ideas take the thinking from Bloom's taxonomy, the revised Bloom's taxonomy that you see here with the remember, understand, apply, analyze, and you'll see the last two have been flipped in the revision, you evaluate and create. And then with that is Webb's concept of depth of knowledge, this idea that we have a depth of knowledge in terms of the kinds of things we ask students to do, and pushing beyond just the DOK level 1 of recall and reproduction to actually move students into depth of knowledge 2 and into depth of knowledge 3 and into depth of knowledge 4, this is a matrix that kind of gives you a sense of what I'm talking about when I say we have to move beyond 1. We have to clearly articulate the skills and concepts that we want students to be able to do, which is the depth of knowledge 2. And with that, we then take the content we're trying to teach our students, and we have them apply the skills that they've got in depth of knowledge 2 into doing the kinds of analysis, the kinds of evaluation, and finally, when we talk about taking action, the kinds of creating that we want our students to do. I've got another way of looking at her work. So this is another way where you can see down one side, one axis is the Bloom's taxonomy, and across the way is the increasing depth of knowledge. But either way, and I know that sometimes you just have to see things in a new way to be able to understand them. So there's a couple different physical versions here of the concept, but the idea is we have got to raise the level of rigor for our students. Our students are capable of asking and answering really complex questions, and they want to struggle with those things. They just need the skills. They need the skills. We need to be explicit about what those skills are. We need to teach them, and we need to help them understand how do you source information, how do you corroborate the evidence, how do you know that that's necessarily a reliable source, and how do you know the pastness of the past? How do you contextualize that information? So there's some really exciting things that are happening out there regarding cognitive rigor, regarding the kinds of things we want our students to be doing in terms of pushing farther into that next realm. And finally, there are so many opportunities for kids to take action. I mean, taking action might be as simple as the history day. We just had History Day here in Utah, and we had hundreds of students creating websites and exhibits and performances and documentaries, and what they're doing is the actual doing of social studies. They're taking the historical skills that they've developed, and they've made it happen. But we can do that with geography bees. We can do that with Model United Nations. We can do that with mock trials, with simulations. There's so many possibilities for putting social studies learning into practice that we don't have any excuse for not doing it. We have no excuse. And we have got to think about the kinds of ways that each of us can take a role in making sure that these kinds of taking action, whether it's academic service learning or a history day, that it's not those things should not be anomalies or kind of like bright spots. Those should be regular, possible opportunities that students are engaging in terms of actually taking action in their social studies classroom, putting what they're learning into practice. That's how you learn it. You don't, Karen Hess says, why would you be on a team where all you ever did was practice and you never got to play? So this idea of we're going to get our students to learn these skills and then they're going to make it happen. And that's why I think that, you know, we really do have liftoff in a lot of really profound ways. We have some incredible shared language across the country about what we expect for kids. And, you know, there's no turning back when a rocket takes off. And of course, there's conflict and controversy and challenge and political strife. Anytime there's change, there's going to be conflict. Anybody who's taught social studies understands that. And so what we have to understand is, what's our goal for kids? What is our bottom line obligation to students? We want them to be in the C3 framework. It's about college, career, and civic life. These are really exciting times in education. These are thrilling times. We have no idea the kinds of ways forward that education will face with technology and the opportunities that we have and the challenges that are faced. But what we know is that social studies and social studies education has a central component, a central part to play in making sure kids can make sense of the world. It's an exciting time. There are unknowns around the corner, but what I can tell you is that if we chart our course clearly, if we focus on inquiry, if we push for cognitive rigor, if we think about a commitment to students that says, you know what, we're going to ask really tough questions in this class, and we're going to give you the skills to help try to figure out those answers. And they may be answers different than what you thought to begin with, and they may be answers that are different than what I think. It's not what's important what I think. What's important is that you're able to craft an argument, and you're able to make those kinds of leaps in your own academic work. That's what we need to do for kids. And if we can help them do that work, then we will have played our part well. And our commitment to education, all of us are committed to generations, not just to next week, not just to the end of the school year, but to generations ahead of us. And so that's really the exciting time. And I think that, you know, the conversation that we have together is pretty darn exciting. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you, Robert, for that thoughtful presentation. Again, we appreciate you taking the time here to be with us and to share these ideas. Just a reminder to everybody, if you have questions, make sure you get those in. We've got a couple minutes here to sort through some of those. And also as a reminder, all the slides will be available on our blog, herfjonesnystrom.com/blog. That will get you that information and the link in an email that goes out in the next 24 hours. Robert, we've got more of like a classroom kind of question here.
Yes.
How often do students take action? These types of activities are very time-consuming, especially with students with learning disabilities. Taking action can't happen in every lesson. Can you kind of give a little bit of color to, you know, on the classroom level?
Sure.
How does this idea of taking action really work?
Yeah, I think that what it boils down to is all of this kind of being, it's about thoughtfulness and planning. We know that taking action can't occur with every lesson, of course, but it can certainly be a capstone experience for a lot of the work that we do. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, one small example might simply be an academic service learning project where students learn about the process for conducting oral histories. And they go to the local nursing home and they conduct oral history interviews, or they bring a couple people in to conduct those interviews. And then the students craft that oral history interview, maybe it was in the context of other events and things that happened during the same time period for that person's life, and they write a finished product that is a life story biography of the person they interviewed. And then the service piece, they walk those back over and give the life story back to the person they interviewed as a product. I mean, the levels of cognitive work that are engaged in that whole process, while still learning the content, is the kind of idea of connecting content and skills with the doing piece. So taking action could even be something as simple as you craft an argument and we'll write a letter to the local newspaper and see how many possibly get published. Or let's craft a letter to our local elected official about an issue we care about. Or let's go to a zoning meeting and see what they say about a skate park for the area. I mean, there's Project Citizen and We the People are both available resources that are out there that give a lot of ideas about putting these ideas into actual practice. And when we say we don't have the time, I think what we have to boil it down to is, what is it that kids are going to remember from our classes, not next year, not 5 years, what are they going to remember 10 years, 20 years from when they were in our classrooms? And we have to think about and think about the kinds of skills we're going to give them that are going to last in their lifetime, and the kinds of experiences that we can provide to them that are going to last beyond the next bubble test.
Great. We got time for maybe 2 more questions here. I'm going to combine a couple of these into one. It seems like from the parent community, what kind of advice can you give educators and community leaders about dealing with sort of the pushback from parents on this, and how do they talk about these ideas with their local community?
Sure. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to talk the talk and walk the walk. And when I mean talk the talk, I mean you do your homework to say, here's what we're doing and here's why. Here's the academic argument for why we're doing what we're doing in our classroom. So that if somebody walks by and says, you know what, you've got a big test coming up, or you've got to, that you can say, I am developing my students' ability to craft an argument, and here's how we're doing that. I'm helping my students figure out how do they analyze social problems, and here's how. I'm helping them, so you're very clear, first of all, with your own academic goals. You know darn well that it's not just covering World War II. We want to uncover World War II. We want kids to discover World War II. And so our job is to figure out how we do that. And we do that by getting clear about what are the specific skills in history, geography, economics, civics, and the other behavioral sciences that we want to make sure our students engage in.
Right. And last question today, Robert. When we look 12 months out, where do you see us with the C3 framework, the Common Core, and this coming together?
You know what? It's gonna. I would look a lot farther out than 12 months, and I would say that, frankly, I mean, even I would say this. I would say that for all the talk about people turning back from some of these things, I grew up in Iowa, and the horses are out of the barn. The door to that barn is open. We are not turning back from the expectations of what we want for our students and what we know students need to be able to do. And what are the alternatives? We're just going to have students revert back to the 19th century kind of classroom strategies? That's not going to happen. Kids require more. They demand more. We can have way much more fun in the classroom engaging in these kinds of questions for the 21st century.
Fantastic. Again, thank you, Robert, for your time today. And
yeah, and I just want to say thanks to those people who are, professionals and who are out there working with kids and committed to social studies. It's a great privilege to be able to do this work.
Great. We appreciate your time. Lots of great questions. If we weren't able to get to your question, we'll try to follow up with you. But that will conclude our broadcast for today. Thanks, everybody, for joining in. And thank you, Robert.
Yep, thanks, Ryan.